Welcome back. I'm talking to Carl James about the creator of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, who in the 1970s was asked to write a script about this mysterious group called Lab 9, which you think was a real group, possibly.
I'm pretty certain there is evidence to suggest it was, yeah.
So tell us about that then.
Well, I mean, there's two interesting things about it, really. Is one, that it's running parallel with when he's brought back to effectively create a new Star Trek movie for Paramount. It's running parallel with writing this script for Lab 9. December 19th, 1975, he completes this screenplay for them called The Nine. And there's a little story to it. Basically, he's telling his own experience, metaphorically. He speaks about this character called Jim North, who's effectively Gene Roddenberry. He's the writer and producer of a popular but long-cancelled TV science fiction show called Time Zone in it, which I would argue is effectively Star Trek. He's approached by an Englishman representing this group called Second Genesis, which I would argue is Lab 9. And they study psychic healing, out-of-body experiences, telepathy, communications with other beings, that sort of thing. In it, he says that this character does witnesses research at MIT, experiments on theoretical physics and telepathy, and he discovers his own telepathic abilities in the process as well, which leads people to some believe that Roddenberry might have actually looked into that as well. Yeah, but I mean, basically, he sums up, he says, he's like the character, his life was changed forever. Those lovely crazies at a Pennsylvania commune, what they made me believe is far larger, far lovelier. I believe that I know now that all life is one, and that we're all part of this wonderful, wondrous eternal miracle that we have yet to fully understand. But what's interesting about it is that Whitmore didn't actually like it. I mean, he liked it, but he wanted more of the actual message of that the Nine were allegedly conveying, and there wasn't enough of that. But he gave the rewrite to another writer friend of his who was working with him on the new Star Trek film at the time as well, called John Povell, and he wrote the rewrite for this Nine script. And it.
So the original commission, they weren't happy with it.
Yeah, yeah.
So they then rewrote it.
Brought in another Star Trek writer, effectively,
right,
who was a close friend of his, working on this new Star Trek film.
Okay.
He wrote it, and it's like, basically, it's like Galaxy Quest on acid. You know, it was really dark and weird, and Whitmore didn't like it at all. And that seemingly was where it ended. I mean, certainly after that, there is some evidence that Roddenberry was going to Lab 9, and that at one point, Phyllis Schlemmer's book.
So this film never got made then?
No, the script was written.
Twice?
Yeah, effectively, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the details of Roddenberry's version, there's this book called Joel Engel, The Myth and the Man Behind Star Trek. And effectively it lays out what he was writing about in there. But it's very little known. It's not talked about in relationship to Roddenberry a great deal. Certainly not, if you watch any documentaries about Roddenberry's life, it's never mentioned. So.
Right. I don't know if you aware of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, where things are often expressed in metaphors. So in Star Trek, there's always some major enemy that's going to attack them and that they have to overcome. Yeah. So for me, what psychologically could be being programmed into people is that we need eternal war, and eternal conflict. Would you know?
Yeah.
That's what Star Trek is selling as a subliminal message.
Yeah. And the alternative message to that as well is a lot of people propose this idea, you know, the whole sort of one world government, the United Nations and that. Certainly if you look at the flag of the United Starfleet and that, it's very similar to the UN flag.
Right.
And people do argue that Roddenberry himself said he modelled the whole Starfleet model, the United Federation planets, on the United Nations model. So
right. So you've
got all that perspective on it as well. So.
Right. It's promoting a new world order or one world government
possibly,
ideology.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I would argue that it promotes every and all agenda with NASA. It's definitely, there's lots of examples of NASA. I mean, I've actually got a quote from DeForest Kelley, who played Dr. Bones McCoy in Star Trek.
So this is Bones from Star Trek.
NASA works with us on our personal appearances. There is always somebody there from NASA with us because they feel that we have lassoed the youth, so to speak, and they're there to sell them on their program.
So much. I'm certain, you look at Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura in Star Trek. She went to work for NASA, recruiting minorities, ethnic minorities and women into NASA and all that.
Right. Now you've mentioned NASA there. I've said in some of my lectures that I believe that NASA is more of a cover organisation for perhaps a secret space program, and that anything that NASA puts out publicly is really just to keep the masses entertained. Rockets were designed over 100 years ago now, and this is what they still put out now with their current supposed space technology. So if they've got their representatives trying to manipulate and keep their eye on Star Trek, which has a massive influence over the masses, I think that's I don't think that they're wanting to genuinely represent space technology. I think they're wanting to represent what they want people to think genuine space technology is, not what the real stuff is. So, so you're going to make a point about NASA and relation to Star Trek.
Yeah. So the evidence is establishing that there's a connection there, and I've showing that there's a connection there between Gene Roddenberry and Lab 9. If you look at what Puharich was doing with his research, we talked about the Faraday cage. This has actually come from NASA astronaut Gordon Cooper, and Puharich studied these children and adults, and he effectively called them space kids, allegedly testing to see what. I mean, I think there's more to it than that. This is what he stated unequivocally, that NASA administrated a mind control program involving school children called Space Kids that was probably run through an MK program. And Cooper was involved with Lab 9, he went there, he saw the experiments at Lab 9, and in his book Leap of Faith, Cooper identified Puharich as the person responsible for the development of NASA's Space Kids project.
Right.
Puharich's assistant Valerie Ranson approached Cooper to develop the project, said they wanted some Cooper's network of connections and things like that. So effectively what you're talking about there is there's this belief that Puharich was involved in mind control research, and Cooper is effectively saying that he was working for NASA on that type of research. So it's an additional spin on what NASA may have been up to at that point in time.
It may be argued that all of this sort of research was 99% mind control, psychotronics technology, and the whole psychic or ESP side of it was just really a cover for it. And that really it was about how to program someone and how to mind control them, and possibly through psychotronics send messages into their head using technology. Now, that's not to say that I don't think psychic phenomenon exists, right?
I do believe
I don't want anyone to think that with researchers such as Sheldrake. But was it more about mind control than ESP, do you think?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, there are numerous quotes. We've got this young lady called Belita Adair, and she claims that she was traumatised by Puharich's experiments with the Faraday cage. She was studied at Stanford and UCLA by Dr. Thelma Moss in 1975. And this is what she said. It was January, February 1977. She says, "I underwent those horrible psychic tests locked in that Faraday cage in Orsini, New York," which is essentially Lab 9, where parapsychologist Puharich conducted hours of research on me, turning off almost all of the air in the cage, moving electrical currents around me. Under his helm, he kept pumping me to obtain the knowledge he wanted, atomic numbers, formulas from the presences that spoke through me. But then you look at somebody like Jack Sarfati, this physicist, and he said he was involved with Lab 9, he was also involved with SRI. He said of Lab 9 and Puharich, "I was then, 1973, simply a young, inexperienced, naive idiot in a very, very sophisticated and successful covert psychological warfare operation run by the late Brendan O'Regan of the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the late Harold Chipman, who was CIA station chief responsible for all mind control research in the Bay Area in the 70s.
Perhaps we could mention Dr. Edgar Mitchell as well at this point. Do you want to say anything about him?
Because effectively in 1971, Puharich went to Tel Aviv in Israel and he met Uri Geller. Pretty much straight away he said that I've got this good friend Edgar Mitchell, former alleged Apollo astronaut, and he can help with the funding basically. So we'd test your psychic abilities, bring you back to America. Eventually they settled on Stanford Research Institute, and he did the research there and at Lab 9 as well. And then in the mid-90s, CIA documentation declassified, and effectively the CIA owned up to funding all of the psychic research, including the Geller testing at Stanford Research Institute. Right. And up to that point, the Institute of Noetic Sciences and Mitchell had effectively claimed that they'd funded it. And there is this clip. Actually, it was a deleted scene from. It went out as an hour-long documentary called "The Secret Life of Uri Geller," but there was a 90-minute version of it. And in this scene that wasn't in the original broadcast version, Mitchell. I'll just play you the clip. You want to have a listen to what he said.
Okay.
So, how did you first hear of Uri? I was interested in telepathy, psychokinesis, and mental phenomenon and so forth. An American physician by the name of Andrea Puharich called me after I came back from the moon and said, I found this rather amazing Israeli young man who can do these sorts of things. Would you like to study him? And I was intrigued, and I told him, yes, bring him to the States and let's take a look. And then I set out to arrange the testing that we did with him at Stanford Research Institute, where I met Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. What I did not know at the time was that the work at SRI was also being funded by our CIA, and only discovered that later. As we finished our work with Uri at SRI, I was called by the head of the CIA and asked to come to Washington and brief him on what we had learned. And that head happened to be George H.W. Bush. He was head of the CIA at that point in time, and it turned out that it was all a part of the same big study. The Russians were studying it, we were studying it, the CIA was studying it, I was studying it, and so it was all a part of the so-called study of parapsychology. I didn't know at that time all the work that CIA was involved in.
All right, Carl, well, we'll discuss that clip after this break.